My husband passed the bar exam on a Thursday, and by Saturday evening he had handed me divorce papers across the kitchen table we had bought together at that little furniture place on Portage Avenue. He was smiling when he did it, not cruelly. That was the part I kept coming back to in the weeks afterward. He wasn't even trying to hurt me. He just didn't think about me at all anymore. I didn't cry. I looked at the folder he pushed toward me. Then I looked at him, and I thought, this is what 8 years looks like. This is what 2 jobs and a nursing schedule that ate through every weekend looks like. Right here in a manila folder with a sticky note that said, "Please review." I picked up the pen. My hand was steady. I signed. He seemed surprised by that. I think he expected tears or shouting or at least some version of the scene he'd probably rehearsed in his head. Instead, I closed the folder, pushed it back to his side of the table, and said I'd be out by the end of the month. I left him standing in our kitchen, his kitchen now, technically, and went to the bedroom to start packing. Let me go back a little, because none of this makes sense without the years that came before. I met my husband when I was 26. He was 28, funny in that quiet way that takes a while to notice, and he had this dream of becoming a lawyer that he talked about like it was still just a dream, something soft and far away. He'd finished an undergrad in political science and was working at a copy center downtown, running documents for a firm that didn't know his name. I was finishing my nursing degree. I was tired all the time in that specific way student nurses are tired, the kind that gets into your bones. But I was also hopeful. I thought we were 2 people building towards something. We moved in together after 8 months, into a 2-bedroom apartment in the west end of Winnipeg, close enough to the hospital that I could walk when the buses were bad. The rent was $1,450 a month, which was manageable on my income but not on his. He was making maybe $20 a month at the copy center. My nursing shifts brought in around $3,800 after tax by the time I was working full hours. We talked about it openly in the beginning. Once I get into law school, once I pass the LSAT, once I get the degree, then things will change. He said it like a promise. I believed him like a promise. He got into law school the second time he applied, University of Manitoba. We celebrated with a bottle of wine and takeout from that Thai place he loved on Corridon. I remember thinking, this is us at the beginning of something. What I didn't understand then was that I was already at the beginning of something. He was at the beginning of something else. Law school cost money we didn't have. His first year, tuition was just over $12,000. We looked at the student loans and the timelines, and we sat down and made a plan. Or I thought we made a plan. Looking back, I think he made a list of things I would cover and called it a plan. I picked up a second shift. Friday nights and alternate Saturdays in the ICU, which paid a shift differential that added maybe $600 to $700 a month. I wasn't sleeping well. I was running on 4 or 5 hours between back-to-back shifts, coming home to make dinner because he needed to study, doing laundry on Sunday mornings while he slept in. I didn't resent it then. I want to be honest about that. I didn't feel like a martyr. I felt like a partner. I thought we were building something together, and I was willing to carry more weight for a few years because that's what you do when you love someone and you believe in what they're becoming. His second year, he got a part-time job as a research assistant. It paid almost nothing, $14 an hour, 12 hours a week. But he was proud of it, and I was proud of him. What I didn't know was that his supervisor was a woman named Amber. She was finishing her own degree 2 years ahead of him, sharp and ambitious and apparently very interested in my husband's future. I didn't find out about Amber until his 3rd year. I found a text thread on his phone. I wasn't snooping, I was looking for a restaurant recommendation he'd mentioned, and his phone was just there, unlocked. The thread went back 7 months. 7 months of things I won't repeat here because they belong to a part of my life I've already closed. I confronted him that night. He said it wasn't serious. He said he'd been stressed and lonely and I was never home. He said, and this is the part I still think about sometimes, not with anger anymore, just this kind of quiet bewilderment. He said, "You've been so focused on working that you stopped being my wife." I was working to pay for his degree. I didn't say that. I should have said that. Instead, I cried, and he apologized, and I believed him, and we stayed together for another 2 years. Those 2 years were quieter on the surface. He finished his degree. He articled at a mid-sized firm downtown, commercial litigation, which he'd always been drawn to. He passed the bar on his first attempt. His firm threw a small celebration, just the articling students and the partners at a restaurant on Broadway. He told me about it the evening before, almost as an afterthought. I bought him a card. I wrote something in it about being proud of him. I meant it. Even after everything, even with the thing about Amber that had never fully resolved itself in my chest, I was proud of him. 8 years is long enough to love someone through their worst moments and still mean it. I didn't go to the celebration. He said it was just colleagues, that spouses weren't really part of it, that he'd take me to dinner that weekend to celebrate properly. I said okay. He came home that Saturday night later than I expected. I'd made pasta. It was cold on the stove by the time I heard his key in the lock. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table and slid the folder over before he even took off his jacket. I stared at it for a moment. I think some part of me knew immediately what it was, even before I opened it. There was something about the way he set it down, not gently, not roughly, just efficiently, like he was completing a task. "I've been talking to a lawyer," he said. "I think we both know this hasn't been working for a long time." I opened the folder. His name at the top. Mine below it. Petitioner. Respondent. I was the respondent in my own marriage. I read through the first page slowly. He had listed irreconcilable differences. He had listed the joint account, the furniture, the lease. He had not listed Amber by name, but she was there in the margins of every sentence, invisible and obvious. He watched me read. He had the expression of someone who had already processed all his grief and arrived at the other side. Calm, prepared, ready to be reasonable. I realized he must have been planning this for months. The whole time, I was picking up Friday night shifts and making cold pasta and writing cards about being proud of him. He had been quietly drafting an exit. I picked up the pen on the table. He had thought to leave a pen, and I signed both copies without saying a word. He blinked. "That's it?" I pushed the folder back to him. "What else is there?" I stood up. I left the pasta on the stove. I went to the bedroom, and I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time, not crying, just feeling the particular weight of a decision that has already been made for you. I found a room to rent within 2 weeks. It wasn't easy. Winnipeg's rental market had tightened considerably that year, and anything decent in a safe neighborhood was going for prices that made my stomach drop. I was on Kijiji every evening after my shifts, calling numbers, getting no answers, or getting told it was already taken. My colleague at the hospital, Paulette, who had been a nurse for 22 years and had the kind of practical compassion that only comes from watching people at their worst and their best, she mentioned that her neighbor was renting out a basement suite. The woman's name was Edna. She was 71, recently widowed, and had decided to rent the suite because her daughter in Calgary kept worrying about her being alone in the house. I met Edna on a Wednesday evening. She answered the door in gardening clothes, apologized for the mud on her hands, and offered me tea before I'd even stepped inside. The suite was small but clean, separate entrance, a little kitchen, a bathroom with a window that looked out at her backyard garden. She was asking $950 a month. She told me the first month was $475, half price, because she remembered what it was like to be starting over. Her husband had left her once, years ago, before they worked things out. She said she'd learned that the hardest part of starting over wasn't the practical things. It was the first month, when everything was raw and uncertain and your brain kept telling you you'd made a mistake. "You didn't make a mistake," she said, though I hadn't told her anything about why I was looking. She just seemed to know. "You're just at the beginning of something new. The beginning is always the expensive part." I moved in that weekend with 2 carloads of things and a box of cookware my mother had driven 4 hours from Brandon to help me pack. My mother didn't say much during the move. She's not a woman who fills silence with noise. She never has been. She just showed up with a minivan and an extra pair of rubber gloves and a container of borscht she'd made the night before. When we were done and the boxes were stacked in Edna's suite and the kettle was on, she sat across from me at the small kitchen table and said, "You know what you're doing." It wasn't a question. "I don't feel like I know what I'm doing," I told her. "That's different," she said. Knowing and feeling are different things. She stayed 2 nights. She helped me organize the kitchen. She bought me a new shower curtain from Canadian Tire because she said the one I'd brought from the apartment was too dark for a small bathroom. Small things. Practical things. The kind of love that doesn't announce itself. After she left, I cried for the first time since the night of the pasta. Not about my husband, or not only about him. I cried about 8 years. About being 34 and starting over in a basement suite that wasn't mine. About the Friday nights in the ICU that I would never get back. About the stupid card I'd written him, the one about being proud. I let myself cry for about an hour. Then I washed my face and went to bed because I had an early shift. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. We split the joint account down the middle, which I know some people wouldn't understand. A few friends raised eyebrows when I told them. But that account had both our names on it. I didn't want to spend months fighting over money with someone I was trying to stop thinking about. The number was significant, but not life-altering. I kept my half, he kept his half, and I decided that what I'd contributed beyond that, the extra shifts, the suits I'd bought him for articling interviews, the $200 I'd spent on dress shirts so he'd look the part at his first firm dinner, I decided to let those go. Not because they didn't matter, because holding on to them would cost me more than they were worth. I also want to say this because it matters. I spoke to a lawyer myself before I signed anything. A woman my friend recommended who worked out of a small office on Main Street. She went through everything, explained my rights, explained what I was entitled to under Manitoba's Marital Property Act, and helped me understand exactly what I was agreeing to. I signed because I understood, not because I was too devastated to think. My husband had kept his articling income in a separate account, something he'd started doing in his second year without mentioning it to me. My lawyer noted that this was something I could have challenged. I decided not to. I wanted it over. I wanted the clean version of the ending. For the first 4 months after I moved into Edna's, I kept my head down. I worked. I came home. I made meals in that small kitchen and ate them at the small table and listened to Edna's garden, which was impossibly full of birds in the early morning. She had feeders everywhere. My husband didn't contact me during those months. The lawyers handled the paperwork. I had told myself this was what I wanted. The clean break, the quiet exit. And it was what I wanted. I just hadn't anticipated how quiet it would actually feel. He had his new career. He had Amber. He had the apartment, the couch we'd picked out together, the good night set. He had a life that I had helped to build and then been removed from, like a support structure that wasn't needed anymore now that the building was standing on its own. I had a basement suite and a very kind elderly neighbor who left fresh mint from her garden outside my door sometimes. I started running in the mornings, not for any particular reason. I'd never been a runner, but because I woke up early and the neighborhood was quiet at 6 a.m. and I needed to do something with the feeling that was living in my chest. I ran badly, slowly, with bad form. I didn't care. I ran through the streets near the river, past the old houses with their wraparound porches, in the particular gray light of a Winnipeg autumn, and I thought about nothing specific and everything at once. By winter, I was running 5 kilometers without stopping. Small victory. I wrote it in a notebook I'd started keeping because Edna had suggested it. Write things down, she said. Not your feelings necessarily, just what you did, what you noticed, what you ate. It helps you see that time is passing. She was right, time was passing. I got a call from the hospital's nursing educator in February. There was a position opening in the clinical education department, a role developing training programs for new nurses, reviewing protocols, mentoring junior staff. It was technically a management-adjacent role, still unionized, but a significant step up from floor nursing. It paid $78,000 a year, which was more than I'd ever earned. The position required an application and an interview, and the educator had called to encourage me to apply. I applied. I spent 2 evenings on the cover letter, which I had never been good at. Edna proofread it for me at her kitchen table, circling things gently in pencil, telling me where I was underselling myself. She'd been a school principal for 15 years before she retired. She knew about cover letters. I got the job. When I called my mother to tell her, she said, "I knew you would." "You always say that," I told her. Because I'm always right, she said. Spring came. I started spending Saturday mornings at the farmer's market on Lydia, the one that sets up in Old St. Boniface, with the Ukrainian bakers and the woman who sells honey with names like boreal forest and prairie clover. I bought things I didn't strictly need. A little pot of lavender, a jar of the boreal honey, a hand-dyed scarf from a woman who made them in her garage in St. Vital. I was learning how to spend money on myself without guilt. It sounds simple. It was not simple. One Saturday in May, I was standing at the honey table when someone bumped into my shoulder, not hard, apologetic immediately. I turned around. His name was Patrick. He was buying rhubarb because his sister had apparently demanded he bring her rhubarb from this specific market for a pie she was making, and he'd been to 2 other stalls already without success. He was tall and a little rumpled, and he laughed to himself easily, which is a quality I've come to think is deeply underrated in people. We talked for about 10 minutes while he found his rhubarb. He asked if I came to this market often. I said I'd been coming most Saturdays since the fall. He said he'd only recently moved to the neighborhood. He was a physiotherapist, recently transferred to a clinic on Provencher Boulevard. He asked if he could buy me a coffee. I said yes. We sat outside a cafe on Tash Avenue for 2 hours. I told him more about my life than I intended to. He listened in that way some people listen, not waiting for his turn to talk, actually listening. When I told him I was a year out of an 8-year marriage, he nodded and didn't make it strange. That's a long time, he said. It was, I said, but it was also time I learned a lot. He asked what I'd learned. I thought about it for a moment. I said that I'm more capable than I knew, and that I was letting someone else decide what I was worth. He looked at me for a moment and then said, "That's a good thing to know." I'll be honest about something. During those months, I thought about my husband more than I wanted to, not with longing. That had faded faster than I expected, which surprised me. More with this recurring low-level anger that I couldn't quite resolve. I thought about the suits, the shirts, the Friday nights, the cold pasta. I thought about that sticky note that said, "Please review." In November, almost a year after I'd moved out, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. A voicemail. I almost didn't listen to it, but I did. It was my husband's voice, oddly flat. He said he was going through some things and thought it might be worth talking. He said he wasn't sure if I'd want to, but he wanted to reach out. He said, and this is the part that stopped me cold, he said, "I don't think I understood what I had. I've been thinking about that a lot." I stood in Edna's driveway in my winter coat and listened to that voicemail twice. The feeling it gave me was not what I expected. Not satisfaction, not anger. Something quieter. Something that felt almost like clarity. I deleted the voicemail. I went inside and made tea and sat at my small table and thought about the version of myself who would have called him back, who would have needed to hear more, who would have wanted an explanation or an apology or some form of reckoning. That version of me had been working Friday nights in the ICU while he drafted his exit. This version of me had a job she'd earned, a neighborhood she'd learned, a neighbor who left mint outside her door, and a man who would drive 40 minutes to bring her rhubarb because she'd mentioned offhand that she liked rhubarb jam. I did not call my husband back. A few weeks later, Edna mentioned that she'd heard something through a mutual acquaintance. She had lived in the city her whole life and knew people who knew people in the way that only long-rooted Winnipeggers do. She mentioned it gently, not gossiping, just informing. My husband's relationship with Amber had ended. He had apparently found the transition to independent life more difficult than expected. Some of the practical things, she said, the kind of things that people take for granted when someone else has always handled them. I looked at my hands around my mug. I thought about the years of handling things. The bills, the groceries, the lease renewals, the car insurance, the dentist appointments I'd reminded him about 4 times. The invisible architecture of a shared life. You never know what you have, Edna said softly, until you've lost the person who made it possible. I'm writing this, or I'm telling this, I suppose, from a place I couldn't have imagined 2 years ago. I'm in a 1-bedroom apartment now, my own place, on the 2nd floor of a building in St. Boniface with windows that look toward the river. I paid first and last and still had money in my account. I hung my own art on the walls. I bought a plant, then 3 more plants because I could, because there was no one to say the apartment was getting too cluttered. I run 4 days a week now. I still go to the Saturday market. I brought Enna a jar of the boreal honey for Christmas, and she gave me a jar of the mint jelly she'd made from her garden, and we stood in her doorway in the cold for 20 minutes just talking. The way you do with people who have seen you at your worst and loved you anyway. Patrick and I have been seeing each other for about 8 months. He still makes me laugh at inconvenient times. He's careful with me in the way that some people are careful when they understand that something has been broken and repaired. Not treating me like I'm fragile, just treating me like I matter. Those are different things, and I've learned to tell them apart. My husband has tried to reach me twice more since the voicemail, once through a mutual friend, once through LinkedIn, which struck me as so deeply strange that I showed it to my mother and we both laughed for a solid minute. I have not responded to either. Not because I'm angry, not anymore. The anger burned out somewhere in that first winter. Somewhere between the early morning runs in the small kitchen and the notebook where I wrote down what I'd eaten and what I'd noticed, and whether the birds had come to Edna's feeders. I didn't respond because I had nothing left to say to him. Not because he'd taken something from me, though he had, but because I had already moved somewhere he couldn't reach. Not a place with an address. Just a version of myself I hadn't known was waiting. I was the one who had worked the extra shifts. I was the one who had carried the weight. And in the end, I was also the one who walked out of that kitchen and built something better with my hands. He got the knife set. I got to find out who I was when no one was watching. That turned out to be the better deal. There's something I've thought about often since all of this happened. The strange, quiet logic of how things unfold when you stop trying to control them and just keep going. I didn't set out to build a better life. I set out to survive the first month. Then the second. Then I just kept putting one thing in front of the other. An early morning run, a job application, a Saturday at the market, and somewhere in the middle of all that small, deliberate living, something shifted. I think about the choices my husband made, and I don't say this with bitterness anymore. What he did eventually caught up with him. Not because the universe punished him, and not because I wished it on him, but because the way you treat people, the way you use them, or dismiss them, or fail to see what they're actually carrying for you, that leaves a mark on your own life. He built his success on a foundation he didn't understand, and when that foundation walked out the door, he discovered he didn't know how any of it worked. That's not fate. That's just consequence. Action and result, plain and quiet. And I think about what I did, not because I was noble, but because it was the only way I knew how to be. I kept showing up for my shifts when I was exhausted. I read the divorce papers carefully before I signed them. I spoke to a lawyer. I made decisions with my head even when my chest felt hollow. That wasn't toughness in the dramatic sense. It was just the habit of thinking clearly, even when thinking clearly was the last thing I felt like doing. Somewhere along the way, I had built that habit without realizing it, and it turned out to be the most useful thing I owned. Edna once said to me, on one of those evenings when we sat in her kitchen, longer than either of us planned, the people who come back from hard things aren't the ones who didn't get hurt. They're the ones who kept deciding, every day, to do the next right thing. I've thought about that a lot. There's something in it that feels true to me, not as a motto, but as a description of what actually happened. I kept deciding, even when I was tired, even when I didn't know if it was working. What I know now, 2 years on, is that the life I have didn't happen to me. I built it. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small rooms, in early mornings, in a basement suite with good windows and a neighbor who left mint outside my door. I built it by being honest with myself about what had happened and what I was worth. I built it by asking for help when I needed it and by not asking for things that no longer mattered. He got the apartment. He got the knife set. He got the version of the life I'd organized for him. I got to find out who I was when no one was watching, and it turned out that was more than enough to start with.